And now we're delighted to welcome the fifth panel session of the RAID conference. We've been talking there about the opportunities for industries of digitalisation. So this panel is about driving digital transformation fairly and responsibly. And to moderate this panel, I'm delighted to hand over to Dea Markova, who is the Managing Director of Forefront Advisors, to chair this panel of experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me, Ben, and congratulations on running a successful digital event. We're looking forward to the offline version in September, as you keep inviting us to. On this panel, we will pick up both a policymakers and an industry view on what it takes to write digital policy rules for responsibility and fairness, as the title says. I am delighted to be joined by Werner Stengg from Margrethe Vestager's cabinet, Miriam Stankovich from the Center for Digital Acceleration, and Alex Rohr, who is from the Computer and Communications Industry Association. So hopefully we can bring them online. Hi, everybody. So we have 45 minutes and a very big topic, but before we deep dive into it, may I ask you to do just a quick round of introductions, and specifically not so much what your role is, but what your current priorities are in the area of digital policy. So we start with Werner, please.
Yes, hello. Many thanks for having me. I'm Werner Stengg from the Vestager cabinet. As you can imagine, at the end of this mandate, our priorities are not really to come up with new stuff. And we have delivered quite a lot of digital stuff in the past 4.5 years. Now all arms on deck for implementation, compliance, enforcement. And that literally because probably compared to past phases of legislation coming from Europe, this is a very different type of legislation that we have in front of us, DSA, DMA, AI Act, and what have you, with a lot of centralized enforcement from the Commission, but also lots of tasks to be fulfilled by other enforcers, but also by all the companies out there, both those that are covered by the rules themselves and those that are meant to benefit from them, because there's a lot of opportunities we have created, not just obligations.
Thanks, Werner. Can we go to Miriam now?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miriam Stankovich, and as Dia mentioned, I serve as a senior principal digital policy specialist with the Center for Digital Acceleration at DAI. Now, my work sits at the vital intersection of technology, law, and policy, and with a strong emphasis on ensuring innovation and equitable digital transformation. I bring extensive experience advising major international organizations such as the International Telecom Union, the World Bank, IFC, and the United Nations, different agencies of the UN. My expertise includes data protection, IP, and particularly the ethical and rights-respecting deployment and governance of emerging technologies such as AI. I'm deeply committed to integrating human rights considerations into AI development and deployment, ensuring these technologies enhance societal well-being globally without compromising fundamental rights. So my role basically involves crafting and implementing policies, working together with government stakeholders around the globe, policies that foster technological innovation and protect and promote human rights in the digital environment, especially in regions vulnerable to technological disparities. Dia, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Miriam. We'll go back to that international perspective in a minute, but before that, closer to home, Alex.
Thank you so much, Dia, and thank you, Raid, for the invitation. CCA, just a few words. We are trade associations headquartered in DC, but based in Brussels for the last 15 years or so. I think in the history of the Brussels office here of our trade association, we spent quite a bit of time on a number of different proposals in legislation. The last 5 years, as Werner pointed out, has been extremely busy. Just to be clear, we represent a number of large tech companies, including also not so large but established companies in the e-commerce e-commerce domain, social media, but also cloud providers, mobility, online mobility service providers, very much a wide variety of tech companies. So right now, our priorities are very much, just like the European Commission, are very much focused on implementation and enforcement, making sure that the 50-odd new pure tech legislation that have been adopted in the last 5 years work with one another. But it's also about paying attention to emerging tech policies, ideas that we fear would ultimately make technologies more expensive than they are today, and ultimately may slow down Europe's digital transformation. But I'm happy to go to dive deeper later down the panel discussion. Thank you again.
And I promise to give you an opportunity to do that, Alex. But let's kind of start with a couple of words that all the speakers touched upon, which is implementation and enforcement. Werner, perhaps it's logical to start with a question to you. You pointed out, understandably for us, that this is what the Commission is currently focused on. But within that big topic, the implementation and enforcement of the DSA, DMA, the AI Act, what are your first priorities, or perhaps the things that you're most concerned about, including in the face of so many elections in Europe and around the world still coming up this year?
First of all, Alexandre said there's 50 plus laws that may have been relevant for the tech industry. Clearly, they're not all equally important. Each and every one is important, but in terms of urgency and probably global impact, it's the one that I mentioned already. It's the whole platform regulation, obviously, the DSA, DMA, and it is the AI Act for obvious reasons. So these are clearly the priorities. And within those priorities, you again, they pointed out the core priority for now is, of course, the elections coming up, because that is one of the also a good manifestation of why we have done this in the first place. Because it's about democracy, it's about accountability, it's about our societies and economies at large. And this is what makes those three legal acts that I mentioned so important, because they sort of have an influence, or the technologies and business models behind them have an influence on each and every one of us, of what we do as companies, as citizens, as employees, as consumers, whatever it is. It is sort of this, the way in which information and content, including product, services, disinformation, whatever, circulates in our world. And we have seen if things go wrong, they can go terribly wrong. And probably for a democracy, the worst thing that can happen is that democracy itself doesn't function anymore, that democratic decisions are not taken in the way they should be taken, that people take informed choices to the extent that they're able and willing to do that. And so we have to do everything we can together, of course, with the tech community and researchers and civil society to make sure that our democratic processes function well.
Thanks, Werner. We might go back to this topic in a minute, but before that, I'm interested in going a little bit more in detail in something that both Miriam and Alex touched upon, which is sitting in the EU or looking at the EU from abroad. Do you perceive these new wave of digital reforms as supporting the other buzzword, which is the competitiveness of the EU? Perhaps Alex, we'll start from you.
Yes. So I think Werner said it very clearly. The driving force, the leitmotif of the European Union during this legislature has very much been about transparency, increasing transparency for online services, creating more accountability, and essentially mitigating both societal and economic risk, perceived risk, from the development of technologies all the way to the deployment of technologies. Competitiveness has not been the driving force, and that's not a value judgment. I think it's just a reality. I think that both can be achieved at the same time. It's not necessarily mutually exclusive, wanting to minimize societal and economic risk that digital transformation may raise on the one hand, and on the other, increasing competitiveness on the other. I think, yes, of course, there's a degree of prioritization in, at least probably from an enforcement and implementation perspective from the government side, but when you're on the receiving end of the lion's share of this legislation, whether you are big tech or you're just a small established regular tech, it doesn't have to be small, but just fairly well established with years of experience on the market across multiple products. When you're on the receiving end of all this legislation, we need to make sure that ultimately those laws do work with one another, that we don't asphyxiate whether it's members globally that are operating in Europe, or more importantly, for the sake of this discussion, European businesses. I think the number one challenge, and I don't really hear it often, is how do we reconcile various legislation, just maybe even focusing on the flagship ones, the DSA, the AI Act. Well, we still have GDPR, which is, remnant from the previous legislature, but there are a number of intersections already in those three legislation. Just to give you an example in terms of, for example, risk assessments, again, DSA, AI, GDPR, and to some extent as well, the NIS2 directive do compel oftentimes the same service provider to conduct similar yet different risk assessments. The risk varies. Sometimes the risks do overlap, sometimes not. Either way, you have to report usually to different authorities, depending on which text you're looking at. So that's a very sort of an administrative burden thing. Another example would be potential contradictions that we can anticipate if we look at, for example, the Data Act. In order to make the Data Act happen, and this new right to data portability for both business users and consumers, a lot of IoT manufacturers are going to have to process a lot more data, a lot more personal data than what they are doing now. And the main reason being is that when you receive a portability request, you need to make sure that you as a company assign that data to the particular individual that requests data portability. So you need to authenticate, you need to create a login system, you need to create profiles in order to have a system in place in the event that you do receive a portability request. How will data protection authorities feel about that? Because manifestly, this seems to fly in the face of a concept that is 3 decades old, which is the data minimization principle. These are just some of the challenges that we can already anticipate in probably 2-3 years down the line. But we need to think about that. We, or at least my constituents, our members, but also I think enforcement authorities as well. Our recommendations at this point is that we anticipate a great deal of overlap, inconsistencies, potential contradictions between various texts. And I think at this point, we may want to already start sort of mapping out what we are talking about for different industries, for different online service providers. That probably is a work that will fall on us. But for the next commission, ultimately, there is probably merit in considering maybe even an omnibus bill or some kind of overarching memorandum of understanding for various enforcement agencies to come together. to work together. Because if we don't do that, I think we'll end up in a bit of a cascade regulatory system where compliance is an ever-chasing goal, which is not the best from a business perspective.
Thanks, Alex. I'm willing to bet that this is not the first time the Commission is hearing this kind of feedback from the industry. So I'll go back to Werner and give him a chance to respond. But before that, Miriam, from where you stand, is the rest of the world looking at Europe and kind of thinking what we're thinking on the inside, that this will improve our kind of competitiveness and our attractiveness to international businesses to innovate and domicile their capacities within the EU, or are you hearing something different?
Well, thanks, Dea, for this question. It's really interesting, and the answer, and it's really complicated and complex. So, I think yes, the rest of the world is looking at the EU and its platform horizontal approach to regulating digital technologies. The impact of EU's new digital rule book, specifically the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, and the GDPR and the AI Act. We know the impact extends well beyond the European Union and influences other countries and global markets in several significant ways. So the first one is a lot of countries around the world, they see EU as setting a global benchmark. Okay, so the DMA and the DSA are likely to have a similar effect to the GDPR and to a certain extent the AI Act. And countries outside the EU may adopt comparable regulations to ensure that their domestic companies are competitive in the EU market and to protect their own consumers and markets from potential abuses by large technology platforms. Now, these acts, so the DMA, DSA, the AI Act, and the GDPR, they collectively form a model of digital regulation that could influence other regions, such as the Middle East, Eastern Europe, countries in Eastern Europe, certain countries in Africa, certain countries in Southeast Asia. And the comprehensive nature of the EU's approach serves as a blueprint for these countries, and this influence extends to how countries outside the EU negotiate trade deals or set up mutual adequacy decisions with the European Union. Then another, I think, potential impact would be encouraging international harmonization. Okay, so we see that the EU influences also international discourse, how countries start to regulate digital technologies, and we can talk about this in detail later. Influencing trade agreements and international policy. I touched upon this aspect as well. It has also impact on multinational corporations, as we see with the DMA and the DSA. Multinational corporations, especially those based in the United States and Asia, that operate in the European Union, will need to align their operations with the DMA and the DSA, and the AI Act, and also drives technology standards and innovation. And we could talk about this international standard setting. But it also, as already highlighted by Alex, it comes with potential resistance and adaptation challenges. And I see this through my work with different governments. While the EU digital regulation might set a precedent, it could also meet resistance because different countries have different regulatory regimes, traditions, and it could be seen these acts as potential trade barriers. And if we talk about the countries of the global majority, of the global South, they might struggle with resources and resource requirements needed to implement similar frameworks, and this highlights the need for international support and international collaboration. Over to you, Dea.
I'll come back to you in a minute. Maybe would ask for a little bit more details on the mapping out, because you seem to be sort of painting the picture of two views onto the EU, right? Sort of one where there's a trade barrier and there's resistance, one which is this is a blueprint to be copied. So I'll be interested to find out how could you bucket the world in these or more buckets. But before that, Vernon, on the question about is the Commission aware of the huge amounts of overlap, I'm exaggerating, that there may or may not be between the new digital rulebook? And how are you planning to address that? Are you working on an omnibus directive for the next term? Maybe I give you a chance to respond to that industry commentary.
Of course, but if you allow me, I will just comment first on a preliminary statement made both by Alexandra and then also taken up a bit by Miriam, and then I answer your question straight on. The first one about competitiveness, because you started out, Alexandra, by saying competitiveness was not the driving force. I'm slightly in disagreement with that. But of course, we're always talking about the laws that we have passed and the risks that they are going to mitigate and so on. But that was always to be seen hand in hand with our investment in innovation agenda from the beginning, from our very first strategy at the beginning of this mandate. And you heard it also in the white paper on AI when we said we don't want just trust, we also want excellence. We have had major investment choices made in Europe. We have the Digital Decade Program, investments from connectivity to supercomputers. So that was the number one. Number two, linked to that, a lot of the legislation that you're talking about was also there to create a single market. And the single market, by definition, is a pro-innovation instrument. So, of course, you can say there is compliance costs from the AI Act, and there will be compliance costs from the DSA and what have you. But at the same time, that provides you with access to 450 million consumers in Europe in a regulation. We've used regulations throughout. Thirdly, a lot of the legislation that you're referring to is not administrative burden as in the good old world when the law, consumer protection for good reasons or other laws were raising additional compliance costs for business. A lot of the digital acquis that we're talking about is about also creating opportunities. You mentioned the Data Act. So that while there may be compliance costs for the equipment manufacturer, it was meant to create lots of business opportunities for the downstream companies, especially SMEs. If we look into the DSA, it is a risk-based instrument with most obligations on the very, very large platforms and much less obligations on the smaller ones. Yet you will see a lot of level playing ground coming up between large and small and other players. The DMA, as the most intrusive law probably, is only there to make competition work. It's legislation, but it is there to ensure open and contestable markets and therefore allow business opportunities for all those that do not hold the market power of the very large ones. So just this is an important, however, preliminary, that a lot of the laws are meant to be pro-innovation, creating legal certainty, creating a single market, creating level playing field for the players out there. Now, if there are trade-offs to be made, if there are improvements to be made, that of course will always be part of the normal process of legislation, where you see, does it work? If it does not work, you can try to repair it. But the important thing here is, I think, you mentioned trade-offs between, for instance, data collection, data sharing, data protection, data use. Perfectly fine. Lots of choices to be made here between different interests. In the past, such choices were made by large private digital companies on our behalf and in their main own interest. Now, the lawmaker has come back and said, in the interest of society, in the interest of competition, of democracy, of whatever, we are taking certain choices, because it's not win-win-win. You have to make choices here and there. So if there's a mistake, you can repair them with the new law. If the big tech, say, made some judgment calls in the past that are not good for society, it's much harder to be undone, because how can you undo market power that was grounded in some of those decisions? So I rather like democratically legitimized decisions that may have to be adapted over time.
Thanks for that, Vernon. Miriam, maybe I'll go back to the question that I alluded to, which is, you sort of there's at least two things you can expect from the international process. One is to follow the use blueprint, to use the word that you used. The other one is to actually rise the trade barriers much higher. And different countries would fit else differently within those two camps. How do you kind of, maybe can you paint us a picture of which ones of the stakeholders that you work with kind of would fit in either one of those descriptions, if you agree with my mapping in the first place?
Yes. So this is again very complicated question, and I'm not a huge proponent of taking a law, regulation, and just just doing copy paste into another country's legislation regulation. So number one, what works for the European Union might not work for another country due to the size of the market, due to the vibrancy of the technology market, due to local conditions, etc., etc. So to answer your question, I think that countries should have a toolkit, take a look at what's out there and see what, for example, the US is doing, what the European Union is doing, what Singapore is doing, what the United Kingdom is doing in terms of regulating digital, artificial intelligence, other types of emerging technologies, and see what makes sense for their own local conditions. And then you have also the regulatory tradition, how fragmented or how complex the market is, what's the level of awareness of consumers and users of digital services and digital products. So I'm a huge proponent of starting first with capacity building, and through my work I work with regulators, with government agencies throughout the globe, to raise their awareness of the challenges and both the opportunities that come with digital technologies, and also what are the areas that need to be regulated in order for these digital technologies to reap the opportunities that come with digital technologies, especially artificial intelligence, right? So that's number one. Then working with consumers and users, that's number two, especially vulnerable and marginalized groups such as LGBT populations, children. We know the next panel is going to be about children and their rights online, the elderly. So these are easily manipulated. By recommender systems and through automated decision-making systems. So I think capacity building is as important as regulation and policy making. And then we cannot just make a general statement. The AI Act or the DSA and the DMA are the blueprint, and each and every country around the world should adopt them. Each and every country and each and every regulator in each and every country should take a look at their local circumstances, and then take some bits and parts of the this so to say EU digital blueprint, and then make sense of what's important for their local conditions and localize. So that would be my message.
Let's pick up one aspect of the rule book, which affects as much as affects Europe as it does the rest of the world, which is elections and sort of misinformation more broadly. And let's maybe discuss or debate on this panel what is the best way to approach that, to write a rule book that delivers the outcome that we want. Maybe we start with Alex. So what do your members think that elections in Europe are a couple of months away? We've seen a number come and go on this year. Others are quick on their heels. What do your members think that? What are the rules that they're happy to take, or the rules that they're happy to make by way of self-regulation on a short notice to ensure that there is no unwanted influence or misinformation around in this electoral year.
Is this from an AI perspective only, or is this?
Well, let's talk about generative AI as kind of the hot topic.
Right.
So they focus the questions, yeah.
Yeah, thank you there. Yes. I think generally speaking, AI as a technology it's a technology. It's a tool, and it can be used for good and bad purposes. I don't think AI on its own as a technology creates risk for our democracies. It's a mere technologies and depends on use cases. The lion's share of the AI Act actually is built, the way we look at it, is built on that premise. And clear differentiations between high risk and low risk or no risk use cases. There are, of course, situations like deep fakes where we are dealing with here synthetic AI generated content intended to, it can be used for various purposes. Deep fakes can be used for, among other things, obviously the bad things would be to deceive users, and that can be indeed problematic. And I think here industry is working hard to detect deepfakes or to flag them, to label them as such, so that users are informed when seeing such content. That's an AI Act requirement that, so the implementation period of the AI Act is still a year away, but that's something I think companies are looking at and have started rolling it out within their systems and their products already today. So, I mean, that's just one specific example here, a very concrete example around deepfakes. But in the end, I think it's mostly about ultimately informing users and educating them.
The Commission's perspective, what are the areas, or are there areas that you are currently concerned about that the industry could be doing more in order to, quote unquote, protect our democracy?
Yeah, I mean, you picked the right example with the elections. And just before I go into that question, it's really one of those global issues that we just discussed, where Europe is not alone, since this is a year where there are so many elections all over the globe. This is being discussed in all the jurisdictions that Miriam has been talking about. So they're all faced with the same phenomena, with the same challenges. So in that sense, I don't even see so much that there's Europe and there's the rest of the world. But we are having lots of discussions from Brazil to Japan, from Canada to Australia, and everyone in between on how to do these things. So that's a universal challenge, if you want, because the large technology operators and the large technology providers are globally active. So we have the same issues everywhere. Now, the Commission on this topic, we just issued guidelines, actually, in this case under the DSA, to the large companies on how to make sure that these elections, all these upcoming elections, are carried out in the most correct way possible. And it's one good illustration of how the DSA, the AI Act, and other initiatives work together. And Alex already alluded to this fact. On the one hand, you have the DSA, where we look into the large companies. We're saying, well, who are the media in a way through which content may be, or where content may be disseminated in a way that is detrimental to elections. So therefore, we have the very large platforms, the very large search engines. So they have to mitigate the risks arising from their platform. Then we have the AI Act, which looks indeed into the technology, and we say, well, are there specific risks coming now from generative AI, from very capable GPAI models that may aggravate the risks on platforms? So yes, it's technology, but still we have to look into what type of new deep fakes may be possible because of that technology. What type of material may be created with the help of generative AI that will be used for disinformation, will be used for manipulation. So that's the technology aspect. And then you have also the code of practice against disinformation, which is also very relevant in election terms. And here, actually, we look into tools and risk mitigation measures, because that's already one environment where we are meeting up with the platforms, with the researchers, with civil society, and say, okay, what are state-of-the-art measures that platforms should take in order to mitigate those risks? So it's really the media, it's a technology, it is the practical tools and mechanisms to find out what these tools are. And concretely speaking, as part of the DSA enforcement, we have sent letters for requests for information to the very large platforms, so asking exactly those questions. What exactly are you doing to mitigate those risks? So I think we have the conceptual framework, we have the tools, and definitely the willingness to employ those tools.
Thank you, Vernon. You mentioned international cooperation. So with 6 minutes and a half left on the panel, I want to do three things. One, remind the audience that you have an opportunity to ask questions, and I'm keeping an eye on them. So if you can use the RAID platform and the appropriate link, the appropriate button, then I'll feed those questions to the panelists. I want to talk about international cooperation and leave a little bit of time to talk about the next mandate and priorities for it. Starting with international cooperation, and I ask you to kind of keep your answers brief so I can achieve my goals within the time remaining. So there is a G20 process, there's a G7 process, there's a UN process, there's an EU-US conversation, there is an AI safety summit conversation. Of all of these, Miriam, from the countries that you advise, how do they perceive this myriad of international cooperation processes, and perhaps which ones are taken most seriously within the community that you work with?
So, thanks for this question. So, I see trends where, like countries from the global majority have started working on AI policies and AI strategies. And, they're kind of lagging behind, more developed countries in blocks such as the European Union, United States, Singapore, Canada, that have started regulating emerging technologies and digital technologies in general. So I think countries from the global majority, from the global south, first look up to countries such as in blocks such as the European Union, the United States, Canada, Singapore, the United Kingdom, to see what they're doing. Okay, and then they are also looking at international fora such as the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, the work which is done by the OECD. We have also the work which is done by the Council of Europe, right? So they are working on the potentially first legally binding convention on artificial intelligence. We have also the work, of the U.S. and other countries, like 100 and something, that signed the draft UN Convention on Artificial Intelligence. And then we have also regional initiatives. So a lot of, I would say, disjointed initiatives at international level, which for certain governments from smaller developing countries might seem confusing. So having the channels and also one place where countries could discuss these issues, like at international level, would facilitate regulating different digital technologies, especially AI. Some of the discussants, they mentioned generative AI and deep fakes in elections. I think just I'm going to finish now. I think that what we need to do is we take the risk-based approach and we upgrade this risk-based approach and take human rights approach. And some countries are already doing it with embedding human rights impact assessment for the consequences and challenges that come with AI, especially generative AI.
Thanks, Miriam. With just about 3 minutes left on our panel, I would ask you perhaps to have a minute each talk about future priorities. So, Alex, I'm sure you have a top 3 or top 5 from your membership. Can you maybe walk us through them really briefly?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll try and be very brief. Werner has mentioned the European Commission has set out ambitious goals for Europe's digital transformation. That's digital decade targets. And now, where we look at where we are today in 2024, and where we look at where we need to be in 2030, I think a lot of the European governments and businesses are still in the early stage of their digital transformation on average. Well, I mean, I invite you to take a look at the State of Digital Decade report put together by the European Commission. It gives you a very clear picture of where we are and where we need to be. I think if we want to speed up digital transformation in Europe, that includes also the provision of digital services in Europe by European companies, not just foreign companies. We can't allow to have policies that will make digital technologies more expensive. And when I look at, for example, the white paper of the European Commission on digital infrastructure, I see remnants of a fair share campaign led by the telecom sector, which seek to reduce competition and ultimately increase the prices of cloud technologies, a very important set of services upon which modern digital services are built upon today. Let's just in terms of magnitude here, what we're talking about, what the telecom industry lobby is asking for, has been asking for about the past 2 years, is 20 billion every year, right? So that's obviously something, part of that would necessarily, if that goes into effect for cloud service providers, that part of that will necessarily get passed on to customers here in Europe. I'm mindful of the time, so I'll stop here.
Thanks, Alex. Vernon, what are your top 3 or top 5, well, top 3 in the interest of time, priorities for the next mandate, do you think?
But the first is definitely implementation, as I said, and not only in terms of compliance, to ensure compliance, which is important enough, but to ensure that the opportunities are being used that we are creating here. And if we create data markets for data, for instance, that we also have companies and startups and small companies able to capitalize on these new opportunities. If we create infrastructures and invest in infrastructures and provide access to supercomputers and things we do under the digital decade, that we have innovators and startups that are able, willing, and capable of pulling this off. The second part for me would be keep open and fair markets in the digital space, which was already part of this agenda, obviously, with the DMA and level playing field. But of course, we need to watch the space on AI, on related technologies, because we want opportunities for all on our markets. That is what drives innovation more than anything else. And thirdly and lastly, again, the global dimension mentioned by Miriam. Of course, we need to align as much as possible with all the jurisdictions around us that have the same value system, and there's plenty of them. So for the interest of society, for the interest of business, we need to make sure that where we can agree on common rules, and if not that, on common standards, common way of doing things, that would be very, very useful.
Thank you, Vernon. Miriam, very briefly, because I'm already abusing my privileges and going over time, but if you were to advise the EU on what they should be focusing after the elections in their legislative mandate, what might be sort of a top priority for you?
Yeah, so I'll be very brief. So the first one is regular updates and adaptive regulatory frameworks. So stay open to latest developments, never set things in stone. International cooperation, I've already spoken about this, and stakeholder engagement. I think that's very important, and capacity building. So these are the 3 top things for the European Commission.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for indulging me with my questions and for being here today on our panel. And thanks again to RAID for having all of us here.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dea. Thank you, Werner, Miriam, Alexandra, for a fascinating panel discussion there. We heard earlier today about, on the panel about data protection, one of the key themes that came up there was striking the balance between privacy and safety. And after another short networking break, we're going to be back with a panel about this specifically in relation to children, who are some of the most vulnerable users online, of course. Very sensitive and very interesting, complex issue. So the panel is called Children First, How to Balance Privacy and Safety. And we have speakers from the European Parliament, from Ofcom, from the Irish Data Protection Commission. We have an expert from the University of Bournemouth and OECD. So looking forward to that. Please rejoin us in just under 15 minutes. See you then. Thanks.